I sat at my antique writing desk, running my fingers over the small brass key I'd kept hidden in the secret drawer for nearly 15 years. Thomas had given me this desk on our 40th wedding anniversary, along with the key to a property he'd purchased without telling me. For safekeeping, he'd said with that mischievous smile I still missed every day. Someday you'll know exactly when to use it. The irony wasn't lost on me that today, my 75th birthday, marked the third year in a row my phone hadn't rung with calls from my grandchildren, or even my own daughter, Eleanor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times, the sound echoing through the empty house that had once been filled with laughter and celebration. In years past, this day would have meant a table laden with gifts, Eleanor fussing over the cake decorations, my grandson Michael playing that ridiculous birthday song on his phone, and little Amelia making handmade cards with too much glitter. Now, the silence was punctuated only by the ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the floorboards that Thomas had insisted on restoring himself rather than replacing. Outside, the magnolia tree Thomas and I had planted the day we moved was in spectacular bloom, its massive white flowers catching the afternoon light. I'd nurtured that tree through ice storms and droughts, watching it grow from a fragile sapling into something magnificent. 3 houses down, Eleanor and her husband David had moved into the charming Victorian I'd helped them purchase 15 years ago. They'd been struggling then. David had just started his business, and Eleanor had been laid off from the university. Thomas and I had covered the down payment as a loan that we never really expected to be repaid. It was what parents did. The property had nearly doubled in value since then, something Eleanor mentioned with pride at every neighborhood association meeting. David's business had flourished, and the grandchildren attended prestigious private schools. Their lives had expanded while mine had contracted after Thomas passed away 5 years ago. The first 2 years after his death, they'd still remembered my birthday. Perfunctory celebrations, but at least acknowledgments. Then came the silence. I opened the drawer and removed a faded blue folder, its edges worn from the few times I'd taken it out to verify that I wasn't imagining things. Inside were property deeds, account statements, and a handwritten letter from Thomas. "Margaret," it began in his precise handwriting, "if you're reading this after I'm gone, remember that. Kindness should never leave you vulnerable." I'd dismissed it as Thomas being overprotective, tucking the papers away where they wouldn't remind me of his absence. But today, I found myself studying the documents more carefully, particularly the deed to Eleanor and David's house. The realization that had been slowly forming these past 3 silent birthdays crystallized into perfect clarity. I wasn't forgotten. I was taken for granted. The assumption that I would always be there, supportive and undemanding, had become so ingrained they didn't even see me anymore. Thomas had anticipated this somehow. He'd structured the property purchase so that while Eleanor and David lived in the house and paid the taxes, the actual ownership remained with me. My phone buzzed with a text message alert, startling me out of my thoughts. For a moment, hope fluttered. Perhaps they'd remembered after all. But it was only Caroline, my neighbor, checking if I wanted to join her for dinner since she knew it was my special day. Caroline, who had only lived next door for 2 years, remembered what my own flesh and blood had forgotten. I placed the key back in its hiding place and closed the folder. The magnolia petals had begun to drift down in the gentle breeze, covering the lawn with what looked like scattered pieces of paper. Thomas had always said the beauty of magnolias was in their impermanence. Their spectacular display was brief, but unforgettable. Like family loyalty, apparently. That evening, as I watered the potted orchids Thomas had given me for our last anniversary together, I noticed something I hadn't before. The purple blooms that had been struggling for months had suddenly produced a new stem, straight and strong, reaching upward. Life finding a way forward, even when the conditions weren't ideal. I set down the watering can and picked up my phone. No birthday messages. Not even a quick text. I scrolled through recent photos Eleanor had posted online. A family vacation. To the Bahamas last month. Michael's soccer championship. Amelia's dance recital. Their lives were full and documented in careful detail. I wasn't in a single image. The decision formed slowly, then all at once. Thomas had given me that key and those documents for a reason. Not to hurt our daughter or punish our grandchildren, but to ensure I wouldn't be erased from the family narrative simply because I was now alone. I opened my calendar and marked a date 2 weeks from now. It would give me time to consult with Thomas's lawyer, Richard, and to carefully consider what I was about to do. This wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition, about being seen again, about reminding them that I was still here, still part of this family, whether they acknowledged it or not. The grandfather clock chimed again, marking the end of another birthday spent alone. But unlike the previous 2 years, I didn't feel the ache of abandonment quite so sharply. Instead, I felt something stirring that I hadn't experienced since Thomas died, a sense of purpose. I looked out at the magnolia tree one last time before drawing the curtains. Its flowers would fall soon, covering the ground with their remains. But the tree itself would stand strong, as it had for decades, its roots deep and secure beneath the surface, unseen but essential. Just like me. Thomas and I had built our lives methodically, brick by careful brick. We weren't wealthy by any conventional standard, but we'd been deliberate with our choices. He'd worked as an architectural engineer while I'd taught high school English for 37 years. We saved, invested in property when we could, and lived modestly, allowing us to help Eleanor when she needed it most. Eleanor had been our only child, arriving after years of trying and multiple heartbreaking losses. Perhaps that was why we'd indulged her more than we should have. Through college changes, 3 majors in 4 years, her first failed marriage at 23, and the career experiments that followed, we'd been her safety net. When she met David in her early 30s, we'd been hopeful. He seemed steady, ambitious, everything her first husband hadn't been. The Victorian house had come onto the market just as they announced Eleanor was pregnant with Michael. It was perfect timing in an otherwise difficult period. The economy had tanked, David's fledgling marketing agency was struggling to find clients, and Eleanor had been laid off from her administrative position at the university. They couldn't qualify for a mortgage, but the house was perfect. Walking, distance to good schools, a yard for children, and in a neighborhood on the cusp of revitalization. "We'll figure something out," Thomas had said, though our retirement accounts had taken a significant hit in the market crash. He never wanted Eleanor to know how much we sacrificed. The solution had been the key I now kept hidden. Thomas had structured the purchase so that while Eleanor and David lived in the house, built equity through the payments, and qualified for the tax benefits, the ownership remained in a trust that I controlled after his death. He'd set up an arrangement where they could eventually buy the property outright, but until then, it remained technically ours. "Just a precaution," he'd assured me. "They'll probably purchase it fully in a few years once they're on their feet." But they never had, despite David's business flourishing beyond our expectations. The arrangement faded into the background, unmentioned during family gatherings, holiday dinners, and birthday celebrations. Perhaps they'd forgotten, or perhaps they simply didn't want to remember. The morning after my uncelebrated birthday, I called Richard, Thomas's lawyer, and our friend of nearly 30 years. "Margaret," he said warmly, "I was thinking about you yesterday. Happy belated birthday." Even Richard had remembered. "Thank you." I settled into the chair by the window, watching a pair of cardinals dart between branches of the magnolia. "I need to discuss the Eleanor property situation." There was a pause. "I've been expecting this call for some time, to be honest." "Have you?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas was explicit about the arrangement. He anticipated changes after he was gone. A lump formed in my throat. Thomas had always seen around corners, anticipating problems before they materialized. It was what made him exceptional in his profession and as a husband. "What options do I have?" I asked. Richard outlined several approaches, from simply reminding Eleanor and David of the ownership structure to more assertive options. I listened carefully, asking questions, considering the implications of each path. As we finished our call, Richard hesitated. "Margaret, if I may speak as a friend rather than your attorney for a moment. Thomas worried about you becoming invisible. After he was gone." His words, not mine. The cardinal pair had built a nest in the highest branches of the magnolia. From my window, I could just make out the female settling in while the male kept watchful guard. He wasn't wrong, I admitted. After hanging up, I made myself a cup of Earl Grey and contemplated my next move. It wasn't just the forgotten birthdays, though they stung sharply. It was the casual dismissal. Eleanor called only when she needed something, babysitting during. Their Bahamas trip had been the last request, quietly withdrawn when I'd mentioned having plans with my book club. The doorbell interrupted my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a fleeting moment I imagined Eleanor standing there with a belated cake and apologies. Instead, I found a delivery man holding a magnificent orchid arrangement. "Mrs. Harrison, delivery for you." The card read, "To the woman who taught me the power of words. Happy birthday. With love and gratitude. James Cooper." James Cooper, one of my former students from nearly 20 years ago. Now a successful novelist whose books lined my shelves. He had remembered, while my own family had forgotten. I placed the orchids beside Thomas's struggling ones, the contrast stark and symbolic. When my phone rang an hour later, the screen displayed Eleanor's name. My heart quickened despite my resolution to remain composed. "Mom," she began without preamble, "are you free this weekend? David and I have been invited to a business retreat, very last minute. We need someone to stay with the kids. It's a wonderful opportunity for the agency, connections we can't afford to miss." No birthday acknowledgement. No, "How are you?" Just another request. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I have plans." My voice was calmer than I expected. "What plans?" The surprise in her tone was evident, as though I couldn't possibly have an independent life. "I'm meeting with Richard, actually." I hadn't planned to see him in person, but the words came out naturally. "Richard? Dad's lawyer? Why? Is something wrong?" Concern finally colored her voice, though I suspected it was more about potential financial implications than my well-being. "Nothing's wrong. Just some matters that need attention." I paused. "Perhaps when you return from your retreat, we could have dinner? There are some things we should discuss." "About what?" Now there was wariness. The house, among other things. Silence stretched between us, crackling with sudden tension. "What about the house?" Her voice had dropped to nearly a whisper. "It's time we clarified some arrangements Thomas made before he passed. Nothing urgent. It can wait until after your retreat." Another silence, longer this time. "I'll call you when we get back," she finally said. After hanging up, I felt a curious lightness. The invitation had been extended, the first step taken. Whether Eleanor recognized it or not, something had shifted. I was no longer waiting by the phone for acknowledgement. I had become the initiator, the one setting terms. The choice was now hers to make. The week after my birthday passed in a curious state of anticipation. I hadn't heard from Eleanor again. No surprise, given how our last conversation ended. The silence felt different now, charged with purpose rather than neglect. I found myself moving through my daily routines with renewed energy, as if I'd awakened from a long hibernation. On Thursday morning, I drove to the bank and requested access to my safe deposit box, something I hadn't done since the month after Thomas's funeral. Inside were our most important documents: birth certificates, Thomas's will, insurance policies, and a sealed envelope with my name written in his distinctive architect's block lettering. I'd never opened it, somehow believing that keeping it sealed maintained a final connection to him. Today felt different. I broke the seal carefully and withdrew several handwritten pages. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're facing decisions I always hoped you wouldn't need to make alone. Remember when we purchased Eleanor's house, and you questioned whether we should maintain ownership? You worried it might create future resentment. I insisted because I've observed how the world treats aging women, especially widows. Invisible until needed, then expected to give endlessly without recognition." I blinked back tears, hearing his voice so clearly in the words. "The property isn't just financial security, it's respect insurance. Our daughter loves you, but she's her mother's daughter in determination, and her father's in stubborn pride. Sometimes love needs structure to prevent it from becoming entitlement." The letter continued with practical advice and ended with, "Whatever you decide, know that I trust your judgment completely. You were always the true architect of our family's heart." I refolded the pages carefully, my resolve strengthening. That afternoon, I called Caroline. "I need your honest opinion," I said after we'd settled on her sun porch with iced tea. "Am I being petty about my birthday?" Caroline, 15 years my junior and refreshingly direct, considered the question. "Birthdays themselves? Maybe. The pattern of being taken for granted? Absolutely not. I'm thinking of making changes that will upset Eleanor. The house situation?" At my surprised look, she shrugged. "Thomas mentioned it to Robert years ago. My husband was very impressed with the foresight. I never intended to use it as leverage. Is that what you're doing now?" The question gave me pause. "No," I said finally. "I'm using it to become visible again." Caroline nodded approvingly. "What's your plan?" I outlined what I was considering. Not removing Eleanor and her family from the house, but formalizing our arrangement in ways that acknowledged my contribution and ensured regular family connection. "They won't like it," Caroline warned. "No," I agreed, "but they'll respect it eventually." That evening I pulled out photo albums from when Eleanor was growing up. There we were at the beach, Eleanor at 7, building elaborate sandcastles while Thomas pretended to be a monster threatening to destroy them. Another showed her high school graduation, her face radiant with possibility while Thomas and I stood on either side, bursting with pride. When had the balance shifted? When had our support transformed from nurturing to expectation? I selected a particular photo, Eleanor and David on the front porch of the Victorian house the day they moved in, Thomas handing them a key tied with blue ribbon, and placed it in a small silver frame. This would be my reminder of original intentions when the conversations became difficult. The next morning, I drove to the Victorian house. Eleanor and David would be at work, the children at school. I just wanted to see it, to remind myself of what we were really discussing. The magnolias I'd insisted they plant when they moved in had matured beautifully, framing the porch with their glossy leaves. The exterior had been repainted recently, no longer the sage green we'd originally chosen, but a fashionable charcoal with white trim. David's Audi sat in the driveway, which was surprising mid-morning on a weekday. As I contemplated whether to drive away, the front door opened. David emerged, dressed casually in jeans and a polo shirt rather than his usual business attire. He froze when he saw my car. I rolled down my window as he approached, his expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Margaret, this is unexpected." "I was just passing by," I explained, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Aren't you usually at the office this time of day?" He hesitated. "Working from home today. project deadline. Something about his manner seemed off, but I couldn't place it. The house looks lovely. You've maintained it beautifully. Thanks. He glanced back at it, a fleeting expression crossing his face. Eleanor mentioned you called. Something about the house? So they had been discussing it. Just some paperwork details that need updating. Nothing to worry about. Right. He didn't seem convinced. She's been meaning to call you back. We've been swamped with preparations for this retreat. Of course. I smiled, determined to maintain pleasantries. I should let you get back to your deadline. Please tell Eleanor I'm looking forward to our dinner when you return. As I drove away, I noticed David immediately pulling out his phone, undoubtedly calling Eleanor. The conversation was beginning. Whether they were ready or not, that afternoon I met with Richard to finalize the approach. We decided on a formal letter outlining the actual ownership structure of the house, followed by a proposed agreement that would provide Eleanor and David with a path to true ownership while establishing expectations about family connection. This seems fair and generous, Richard commented, reviewing the document. They're getting a tremendous deal financially. The financial aspect isn't my primary concern, I explained. It's what the arrangement represents. Understood. He gathered the papers into a folder. I'll have this delivered to them next week, after they return from their retreat. No, I decided. Send it tomorrow. I want them to have time to process it before we meet. As I left Richard's office, I felt a weight lifting. For 5 years, I'd drifted in the currents of grief and increasing invisibility. Now I was charting my own course again. Back home, I noticed Thomas's orchid had produced another unexpected bloom, brilliant purple against dark green leaves. I touched it gently, remembering how he'd nurtured it through countless cycles of growth and dormancy. You were right, I whispered to the empty room. Sometimes love needs structure. My phone chimed with a text message from Eleanor. Mom, can we move our dinner to this Sunday? We decided to skip the retreat. We need to talk. The transition had begun. Whatever came next, I had taken the first step back into my own power, carrying Thomas's wisdom with me like a talisman against invisibility. Sunday evening arrived with a crystalline clarity to the air that belied the tension to come. I'd spent the day moving with deliberate calm, arranging fresh flowers for the dining table, preparing Thomas's famous pot roast that Eleanor had always loved, setting out the good china we'd reserved for special occasions. Not because I expected a celebration, but because I wanted to acknowledge the significance of what we were about to discuss. At precisely 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Eleanor, David, and the children stood on my porch in what appeared to be carefully coordinated outfits, all in variations of navy blue and beige, like they were posing for a catalog shoot. Eleanor clutched a small gift bag, clearly a hastily purchased afterthought. Happy belated birthday, Mom, she said, leaning in for an air kiss that barely grazed my cheek. We've been terrible, I know. Michael, now 14 and nearly as tall as his father, mumbled a greeting while staring at his phone. 12-year-old Amelia at least made eye contact, though her smile seemed rehearsed. Look what I made in art class, Grandma, she said, handing me a small ceramic dish glazed in uneven blue stripes. It's beautiful, darling. Thank you. I led them into the living room, where I'd arranged drinks and appetizers. I thought we might eat in about half an hour. Give us time to catch up first. David immediately poured himself a generous scotch. From the decanter on the sideboard, Thomas's scotch, which I kept for special occasions. Eleanor perched on the edge of the sofa, her posture rigid. So, she began with forced brightness, how have you been? The garden looks wonderful. I've been well, thank you. The hydrangeas are particularly good this year. I settled into Thomas's old leather chair, the one positioned to command the room. How's the agency, David? Still growing? He swirled his scotch, not meeting my eyes. We've had to make some adjustments with the economic shift, but we're holding. Steady? That's good to hear. And the retreat you canceled? Was it important? Eleanor and David exchanged glances. Not as important as family, Eleanor replied smoothly. Once we received Richard's letter, we realized we needed to address this situation immediately. There it was. No pretense of a casual family dinner. They'd come with an agenda. I see. I maintained my calm. And what aspects of Richard's letter did you find most pressing? Eleanor's composure slipped slightly. Mother, the letter claims you own our house, the house we've lived in for 15 years, the house where we've raised our children. Not claims, Eleanor. States a legal fact. The documentation was included. But that can't be right. She leaned forward, her voice rising slightly. We've been making payments all these years. We've maintained it, improved it. We paid for a complete kitchen renovation 3 years ago. Yes, you have, I acknowledged. And you've built substantial equity. But as the letter explains, those payments have been mortgage payments to the trust, not to a bank. The trust that Thomas established and that I now control. David set down his glass with more force than necessary. This feels like a betrayal. Margaret, all these years letting you believe what exactly? I interrupted, my voice still measured. That we gave you a $300,000 house as a gift? We helped with the down payment and arranged financing when no bank would approve you. We never concealed the arrangement. You signed all the documents. Eleanor's eyes glistened with tears that seemed more angry than hurt. That was 15 years ago. David's business was just starting. We were struggling. Things are different now. Yes, they are, I agreed. Which is why the letter also includes a very generous offer for you to purchase the house at well below market value. Michael looked up from his phone for the first time, suddenly interested in the adult conversation. Wait, we don't own our house? Grandma does? Eleanor shot him a warning look. This doesn't concern you, Michael. Actually, I said gently, it concerns all of you. Family always does. I rose and moved to the sideboard, pouring myself a small sherry before continuing. The house was always meant to be a bridge, not a gift. A way to help you establish yourselves during a difficult time. Thomas and I assumed that once you were financially secure, you'd want to formalize the arrangement or purchase it outright. So, why bring this up now? David demanded. After 15 years of silence? After Thomas has been gone for 5? The question hung in the air, the real heart of the matter. Because I've been silent about many things for too long, I replied simply. 3 birthdays, 3 Christmases, countless Sunday dinners that used to be tradition. I've become convenient rather than essential. And Thomas... I paused, steadying my voice. Thomas anticipated this might happen. Eleanor flushed. This is about your birthday? You're threatening our home because we forgot your birthday? No, Eleanor. The ownership of your home has never changed. What's changed is my willingness to remain invisible. A heavy silence fell over the room. Amelia, who had been quiet throughout, suddenly spoke up. Mom said we were too busy to come for your birthday. But I made you a card. It's still in my desk. Eleanor looked stricken. Amelia? It's true, the girl insisted. I asked twice if we could bring it over. I felt a rush of affection for my granddaughter, whose honesty cut through the adult tension. I would love to see that card someday, Amelia. David cleared his throat. Margaret, what exactly are you proposing here? The letter mentions conditions, beyond just purchasing the house. Yes, I confirmed. The financial terms are very favorable, essentially the remaining balance on the original loan. But there are relationship terms as well. Relationship terms? Eleanor echoed incredulously. What does that mean? Weekly family dinners, monthly outings with the grandchildren, holiday celebrations, regular, meaningful connection, not just when it's convenient or when you need something, David scoffed. You can't legally enforce that. No, I agreed. But I can make it a condition of the extraordinarily favorable purchase terms I'm offering. Otherwise, we can maintain the current arrangement, with me as the legal owner. Eleanor stood abruptly. This is manipulation. Pure and simple. Is asking. To be included in my family's life manipulation? I kept my voice steady. Is wanting to know my grandchildren beyond perfunctory holiday visits too much to ask? We've been busy building our lives, she protested, and I've been erased from them in the process. The timer in the kitchen chimed, signaling that dinner was ready. For a moment, no one moved. I think we should discuss this another time, Eleanor finally said, when we're all less emotional. Dinner is ready, I replied. And we're family. Difficult conversations are part of that. I'm not hungry, Eleanor announced. David children were leaving. Michael looked relieved, already heading for the door. David hesitated, perhaps calculating the financial implications of walking away. Amelia looked torn, her young face showing more emotional intelligence than her parents. Can I stay, Mom? She asked quietly. I want to have dinner with Grandma. Eleanor looked shocked. No, Amelia. We're leaving as a family. As they gathered their things in strained silence, I remained seated in Thomas's chair, watching the family tableau fracture before my eyes. This wasn't how I'd hoped the evening would unfold, but perhaps it was necessary, the painful lancing of a wound before healing could begin. The offer remains open, I said as they reached the door. All of it, both the house and the chance, to rebuild our family. Eleanor paused, her hand on the doorknob. Without turning, she said, You've changed, Mom. No, I corrected gently. I've remembered who I am. The door closed behind them with a quiet click that echoed in the empty house like a period at the end of a chapter. The days following that disastrous dinner unfolded in a silence more complete than any I'd experienced since Thomas died. No calls, no texts, not even the occasional social media photos of the grandchildren that had been my window into their lives. It was as if my family had collectively decided that since I wouldn't be invisible on their terms, I wouldn't exist at all. I maintained my routines with deliberate care, tending the garden in the cool morning hours, meeting my book club on Wednesday, afternoons volunteering at the library on Thursdays. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, I found myself analyzing every interaction with Eleanor over the past 5 years, searching for the moment when support had transformed into expectation, when my presence had shifted from valued to assumed. On Friday morning, as I pruned, "The hydrangeas!" Caroline called over the fence. "You've been quiet this week," she observed, coming through the gate with a basket of fresh tomatoes from her garden. "How did Sunday's dinner go?" I straightened, feeling the familiar ache in my lower back. About as well as a controlled demolition. Inside, over coffee and tomato sandwiches, I recounted the evening. Caroline listened without interruption, her practical face registering concern but not surprise. "They made you the villain," she concluded. Classic deflection. Much easier than acknowledging they've been taking advantage of both your generosity and your property. Eleanor accused me of manipulation, of using the house to force a relationship. Caroline snorted. How convenient to forget the 15 years of financial benefit they've enjoyed. Have they even calculated what they've saved by not having a commercial mortgage, the tax advantages, the below-market payments? I hadn't, actually. The financial aspects had always been secondary to the desire to help our daughter. Thomas handled those details. Well, my Robert did some rough calculations years ago when Thomas first told him about the arrangement. He was impressed with the structure, said it was worth at least 6 figures to them over the life of the deal. The thought made me uncomfortable. Not because I begrudged them the advantage, but because I'd never considered quantifying what had been, to Thomas and me, simply an expression of love and support. It was never about the money, I said. Of course not. For you? Caroline's gaze was direct. But I wonder if the same is true for them, especially David. After she left, I pulled out the financial records Thomas had kept meticulously organized. He'd created a separate file for the house arrangement, with every payment recorded, every tax benefit calculated, every improvement to the property documented. According to his notes, the Victorian had nearly tripled in value since we'd purchased it, while Eleanor and David's payments had been set at a fixed rate well below market. I was still reviewing the documents when the doorbell rang. To my surprise, Richard stood on the porch, his expression grave. "I wasn't expecting you," I said as I ushered him in. "I received a call from David this morning." He settled into a chair at the kitchen table, declining my offer of coffee. He was quite worked up, threatening legal action. On what grounds? I felt a flash of indignation. The paperwork is clear. They've known the arrangement all along. Technically, yes. But David claims they were under the impression that the trust was merely a vehicle for the financing, not actual ownership. He's arguing there was an understood agreement that the house would be fully theirs once they demonstrated financial stability. And has he provided any documentation of this understood agreement? Richard shook his head. No. It's all verbal claims. Legally, they don't have a case. But they're prepared to make this messy, Margaret. What are you suggesting? Nothing. You don't want to do, he assured me. I'm simply conveying the situation. David mentioned Elena Winters from the Herald is a client of his agency. She covers real estate and financial disputes. The implied threat was clear. They would take this private family matter public if necessary. He's bluffing, I said, with more confidence than I felt. Probably, Richard agreed. But it shows how seriously they're taking this. After Richard left, I sat in the garden, watching bees navigate the hydrangea blossoms with single-minded purpose. My phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. "Grandma, it's Amelia. I'm using my friend Zoe's phone. Can I come see you tomorrow? Don't tell Mom." My heart clenched. I shouldn't encourage secretive behavior, but the connection felt too precious to refuse. "Yes," I replied. "But let's be honest with your mother. Tell her where you'll be." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. "She won't let me." I considered my response carefully. "Then tell her you're going to Zoe's. You can both come here. I won't mention our conversation." It wasn't ideal, but I couldn't bear to close this small opening. The next day, Amelia arrived, with a waifish girl I assumed was Zoe. Both carried bulging backpacks and wore expressions of nervous defiance. "We told Mom we're working on a social studies project," Amelia explained, hugging me tightly. "Which isn't completely a lie. I'm doing my family history assignment." I ushered them into the kitchen, where I'd prepared a plate of the chocolate chip cookies Amelia had always loved. "And what does this assignment involve?" "Interviewing family members about their lives." Amelia pulled out a notebook and pencil case decorated with anime characters. "Most kids are interviewing their parents, but I said I was interviewing you because you're more interesting." Despite the circumstances, I smiled. "And what would you like to know?" For the next hour, Amelia asked surprisingly thoughtful questions. About my childhood, my teaching career, how I'd met Thomas, and our early years together. She recorded everything diligently while Zoe alternated between polite attention and scrolling through her phone. "Can I see pictures of Mom when she was little?" Amelia finally asked. "For the project." I brought out the albums I'd reviewed earlier that week. Amelia pored over them, fascinated by a mother she'd never known as a child herself. "Mom looks happy here," she observed, pointing to a photo of teenage Eleanor sitting on Thomas's shoulders at a carnival. "She doesn't laugh like that anymore." The simple observation pierced me. "When did she stop?" Amelia shrugged. "I don't know. She and Dad argue a lot about money. More since you sent that letter." I carefully kept my expression neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that. Dad says you're being Unreasonable. She looked up, her young face serious. But I think they're the ones being unfair. They didn't even let me give you your birthday card. I gently changed the subject, not wanting to place her in the middle of adult conflicts. As the girls prepared to leave, Amelia hugged me again. Can I come back next week for more interviewing? You're always welcome here, I assured her. But perhaps we should talk to your mother about it directly. Her face fell. She'll say no. Let me try, I offered. I'll call her tomorrow. After they left, I examined the pages Amelia had shown me from her notebook. Among the interview notes and drawings was a family tree she'd created, with a small heart drawn next to my name. Below it, she'd written, Grandma Margaret, the keeper of stories. That simple phrase captured what I feared most about becoming invisible to my family. Not just the loss of connection, but the erasure of shared history, the stories that bound us together across generations. The next morning, I called Eleanor. The call went directly to voicemail, as I'd expected. Eleanor, it's Mom. Amelia visited yesterday for a school project. She'd like to continue our interviews. I'm hoping we can discuss this directly. Please call me back. No response came. Instead, that afternoon, an email arrived from an unfamiliar address, dwinterswinterslegal.com. The message was brief and formal, informing me that David and Eleanor had retained legal counsel and requesting that I direct all future communications through their attorney. The final line read, Furthermore, please refrain from direct contact with the minor children without parental supervision and explicit permission. They had effectively cut me off from even the smallest connection to my grandchildren. The disillusionment that had been building crystallized into a cold certainty. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It had become a power struggle in which my only value was financial. Thomas had seen it coming, had tried to prepare me, but nothing could have prepared me for the hollow ache of being legally separated from the family I had helped build, nurture, and support through decades of love and sacrifice. The letter from Winters Legal arrived via certified mail 3 days later, thick with legal terminology that seemed designed to intimidate rather than clarify. I laid it on the kitchen table, untouched for hours, as if opening it might release some toxic substance into my carefully maintained home. When I finally slit the envelope, the contents were worse than I'd feared. Not only were David and Eleanor disputing the ownership structure of the house, but they were also making claims about other financial matters. Allegations that Thomas had promised them additional property, suggestions that I had unduly influenced his estate planning, and demands for a full accounting of assets they believed should have been part of their inheritance. The letter painted me as a manipulative widow withholding their rightful property, using emotional blackmail to control their lives. It bore so little resemblance to reality that I might have laughed if it hadn't hurt so deeply. I called Richard immediately. They're claiming Thomas was mentally compromised when he set up the trust, I said, my voice shaking despite my efforts to remain calm, that I've been misleading them about their rightful inheritance. Richard's sigh was heavy with resignation. I was afraid they might take this approach. It's a common tactic when the legal facts aren't in their favor. Attack the mental capacity of the deceased and the motives of the surviving spouse. What do they hope to gain? Surely they must know these claims are baseless. Leverage, Margaret. They're hoping you'll be so distressed by the accusations and the prospect of a public, legal battle that you'll concede everything rather than fight. They're using Thomas's memory as a weapon. The realization made me physically ill. After everything we did for them, I'll prepare a measured response, Richard assured me. Don't engage with them directly. That's exactly what they want. To provoke an emotional reaction they can use against you. After we hung up, I sat motionless at the kitchen table, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the legal documents that reduced my family relationship to adversarial claims and counterclaims. Outside, the mailman delivered another round of ordinary mail, bills, advertisements, a magazine. the mundane continuing alongside the catastrophic. I sorted through the pile mechanically until a bank statement caught my eye. It wasn't from my regular account, but from a small regional bank Thomas had used for business purposes. I'd been receiving these statements for years but had paid little attention to them, assuming they were related to old projects that were winding down after his death. This time I opened it carefully and studied the contents. The account balance was substantial, nearly $200,000. A note attached to the statement indicated that a certificate of deposit had matured and been automatically rolled over into this account. I found a folder with previous statements and spread them across the table, creating a timeline. The account had been established shortly after we purchased Eleanor's house, with regular deposits made quarterly until Thomas's death. The memo line on each deposit slip read simply, E&D Housing Fund, HOI. Hands trembled as I calculated the total. Over 15 years, Thomas had systematically set aside a portion of the payments Eleanor and David made, creating a separate fund I hadn't known existed. According to a letter I found buried in the file, dated just weeks before his death, the fund was intended to provide for Eleanor and David's eventual homeownership when the time is right. Thomas had been planning all along for them to own the house outright, not as a gift, but as the culmination of a carefully structured arrangement that preserved both their dignity and financial responsibility. He simply hadn't lived long enough to see it through. And I, lost in grief, had never discovered his complete plan until now, when everything had deteriorated into legal threats and family estrangement. I called Caroline, needing a clear-eyed perspective, before proceeding. Thomas created a fund to eventually transfer the house to them, I explained after showing her the documents. But they're threatening legal action before I even had a chance to understand his full plan. Caroline examined the statements. The timing is interesting. This account would have reached the target amount for a reasonable buyout right around now. Thomas was thinking long-term. What should I do? Tell them about the fund? She considered this. If you reveal it now, after they've made legal threats, it looks like you're capitulating. They'll never believe you just discovered it. So I should withhold information about money that was intended for them? The idea violated every principle I held. No, Caroline said firmly. But you need to present it properly, with legal protection. This changes everything, Margaret. You have the means to resolve the ownership issue without surrendering your dignity or your relationship demands. That evening, alone in the house that suddenly felt too large and too quiet, I made my decision. I would not be bullied by legal threats, nor would I withhold what Thomas had intended for our daughter. But neither would I simply hand over everything, without addressing the deeper issue, my systematic erasure from their lives. I placed the bank statements in a folder alongside the photo of Eleanor and David receiving their house key 15 years ago. Then I added one more item, the birthday card from Amelia that she'd never been allowed to give me, which Zoe had slipped into my hand as they left, whispering, "She really wanted you to have this." The card, made with a child's earnest artistry, reads simply, "To Grandma who remembers everything important." It was time to remember who I was, not just Eleanor's mother or Thomas's widow, but Margaret Harrison, a woman of substance and dignity who deserved to be seen. The weight of discovery, both of Thomas's hidden fund and of my family's willingness to threaten legal action against me, left me feeling untethered in my own home. Every room held memories now overshadowed by present conflicts. The garden, once my sanctuary, felt exposed, as if at any moment I might look up to find David or Eleanor watching from the street, calculating their next move. I needed space to think clearly, away from both the emotional pull of family history and the mounting legal pressure. When my phone rang and displayed my sister Diana's number, it felt like divine intervention. "Maggie," she said, using the childhood nickname only she still used. "I've been thinking about you all week. Something kept telling me to call." Diana was my younger sister by 6 years, the free spirit to my practical nature. While I'd built a life of orderly dedication to family and career, Diana had traveled extensively, married and divorced twice, and finally settled in a charming cottage on the North Carolina coast, where she created and sold pottery to galleries and tourists. I hadn't seen her in person since Thomas's funeral, though we spoke regularly. We'd always maintained a connection that required no explanation or justification, the kind I'd once thought I shared with Eleanor. "How would you feel about a visitor?" I asked impulsively. "You? Here?" Her surprise quickly transformed to delight. "Maggie, I've been asking you to visit for years. When can you come?" "Is tomorrow too soon?" Her laughter bubbled through the phone. "I'll air out the guest room right now." That evening, I packed with methodical care, selecting comfortable clothes, practical shoes, and a few cherished photos, including the one of Eleanor's family on the day they received the house key. I added Thomas's letter from the safe deposit, box and copies of the newly discovered financial documents, securing everything in a leather portfolio he'd given me decades ago. Before leaving, I called Richard to inform him of my discovery and my plans. "This changes the legal landscape significantly," he agreed after I'd explained about the special account. "It proves Thomas's intentions were always to transfer ownership eventually, but on specific terms, exactly what you've been saying." "I'll be at Diana's for at least 2 weeks," I told him. "You have her contact information. I need time to think without legal threats arriving daily. Take all the time you need. I'll handle any communications from their attorney and prepare our response. And Margaret, this trip is a good idea. Distance provides clarity." I left early the next morning, the rising sun casting long shadows across my garden as I locked the door. I'd arranged for Caroline to check my mail and water the plants, leaving her a spare key and detailed instructions. As a final precaution, I'd called the local police department's non-emergency line, explaining that I would be away and asking them to make occasional drive-by checks on the property. "Expecting trouble, Mrs. Harrison?" the officer had asked. "Just being cautious during a family disagreement," I'd replied, not wanting to elaborate. The drive to Diana's coastal cottage took nearly 6 hours, the suburban landscapes gradually giving way to pine forests, and finally the salt marshes that signaled my approach to the coast. With each mile, I felt the constriction in my chest loosening, as if the physical distance was creating emotional space as well. Diana was waiting, on her porch swing when I pulled into her shell-lined driveway, her silver-streaked hair blowing in the ocean breeze. She bounded down the steps with the energy of someone decades younger, enveloping me in a fierce hug that smelled of clay and lavender. "Look at you," she said, stepping back to study my face. "You're exhausted, but you've got that Harrison determination in your eyes. Come in. Everything else can wait." Diana's cottage was exactly as I'd imagined from her descriptions. Sun-drenched rooms filled with handmade pottery, driftwood sculptures, and colorful textiles collected during her travels. The walls were a warm cream that glowed golden in the afternoon light, and every window framed a view of either lush garden or distant shoreline. "The guest room is small but has the best morning light," she explained, showing me to a white-painted space with a patchwork quilt on the bed and watercolor seascapes on the walls. "I thought you might like being able to see the sunrise over the water." I set my suitcase down, unexpectedly overcome with emotion. "Thank you, Diana, for everything." She squeezed my shoulder. "You've spent your whole life taking care of others. Maggie, it's time someone took care of you for a change." That evening, after a simple dinner of fresh seafood and vegetables from Diana's garden, we sat on her screened porch with glasses of wine, listening to the distant rhythm of waves. I finally shared the full story: the forgotten birthdays, the growing distance, the house arrangement, and now the legal threats that made reconciliation seem impossible. Diana listened without interruption, her expressive face registering shock, anger and sadness in waves. The part that hurts most, I concluded, is that they seem to see me only in terms of what I can provide, financially, practically. The relationship itself has no value to them. That's not entirely true, Diana countered gently. If the relationship had no value, they wouldn't be fighting so hard. They're afraid of losing control, of the narrative, of the property, of the power dynamic they've grown comfortable with. Your standing firm has threatened all of that. I considered this perspective. Perhaps, but threatening legal action against your elderly mother hardly suggests valued connection. It suggests desperation, Diana corrected. People resort to legal threats when they feel cornered. You've changed the rules of engagement, Maggie, after years of accepting their terms. Of course they're panicking. In the days that followed, I settled into a rhythm dictated by nature rather than obligation. I woke each morning to watch the sunrise from the small balcony off my room, joined Diana for beach walks before the day grew too warm, and spent afternoons reading or helping in her pottery studio, where the tactile process of working with clay provided meditative focus. Gradually, the constant tension I'd carried in my shoulders and jaw began to release. The legal documents remained in their portfolio, unopened. Richard sent occasional brief updates by email, but I instructed him to handle everything without my direct involvement for now. Distance really does help, I told Diana one evening as we watched pelicans glide over the water. I can think about Eleanor without that immediate knot of hurt forming. Diana nodded. Sometimes we need to step away from something to see it clearly, like backing up from a painting to appreciate the whole composition rather than fixating on one brushstroke. In this sanctuary of sunlight and salt air, surrounded by my sister's unconditional acceptance, I began to envision possibilities beyond the bitter standoff that had seemed inevitable. Thomas's hidden fund wasn't just a financial solution, it was a reminder of his foresight and his belief that relationships could be repaired with time and the right structure. For the first time since discovering Eleanor's betrayal, I felt hope taking root alongside my determination. Not hope that everything would return to a fantasy of family harmony, but that something new and honest might emerge from the painful clarity of recent revelations. 10 days into my stay with Diana, the fragile peace I'd found was disrupted by an unexpected call from Caroline. "Margaret, I'm sorry to bother you during your getaway, but something strange happened this morning." Her usually steady voice held an edge of concern. "David came by your house." I sat up straighter in Diana's porch swing. "What do you mean, came by?" "I was watering your hydrangeas when his car pulled up. He seemed surprised to see me there. Asked where you were, when you'd be back. I didn't give specifics, just said you were visiting family." "Did he say why he was there?" "Claimed he wanted to talk without lawyers present. But, Margaret, he had a real estate agent with him. I recognized her from her billboard ads. They were both carrying folders. It looked like they were planning to inspect the property." A chill ran through me, despite the warm coastal breeze. "He brought a real estate agent to my house while I'm away." "That's not all," Caroline continued. "When I told him you weren't available, he asked if I had a key. Said they just wanted to document the comparative property values for their case. I refused, of course. The agent looked uncomfortable, like she hadn't been told the full situation. "Thank you for protecting my home," I said, my mind racing with implications. "Did he leave after that?" "Eventually, but not before taking photos of the exterior and making a show of writing down notes about the neighborhood comps. It felt invasive." After ending the call with Caroline, I joined Diana in her pottery studio, relaying what I'd just heard. She set down her clay-covered tools, wiped her hands on her apron, and fixed me with a penetrating look. "They're escalating," she said flatly. "Trying to build a case about property values to strengthen their legal position. But showing up unannounced with a real estate agent crosses a line." "I should go back," I said, though the thought of returning to that atmosphere of conflict made my stomach clench. "Not yet," Diana counseled. You've found your footing here. Don't let them rush you back into confrontation before you're ready. She thought for a moment. But perhaps it's time to review those financial documents again. See the whole picture clearly. That afternoon, while Diana worked in her studio, I spread Thomas's financial records across the guest room bed. The bank. Statements from the special account told a clear story. Structured deposits, careful growth, all with documented purpose. But it was a thin folder labeled Victorian Property Complete File that caught my attention. I hadn't examined it closely before, focusing instead on the surprise discovery of the special account. Inside were not just the original purchase documents and trust arrangements, but a detailed history of the property itself, including the inspection, reports, renovation permits, and, most surprisingly, a complete set of correspondence between Thomas and the previous owners, dating back to before we'd even told Eleanor about the house. I read through the letters with growing astonishment. The Victorian had been owned by an elderly couple, the Whitfields, who had raised their family there and were reluctantly selling because maintaining the large property had become too difficult in their advancing years. They had been hesitant to accept our offer because a developer had made a competing bid to tear down the house and build luxury townhomes. Thomas's letters revealed how he had persuaded them to sell to us instead, promising that the house would remain a family home, preserved and maintained rather than demolished. He had even arranged for the Whitfields to meet Eleanor and David, presenting them as the young family who would be living in and loving the home the Whitfields had cherished for decades. The final letter in the sequence, dated just after the key, closing, included a handwritten note from Mrs. Whitfield. Mr. Harrison, knowing our beloved home will continue to shelter generations of your family, brings us more comfort than the additional money ever could. Thank you for understanding that some things have value beyond their price. Tears welled in my eyes as another piece of the puzzle fell into place. The house had never been just a financial arrangement or an investment property to Thomas. It had been a sacred trust, a promise made to the Whitfields that their family home would continue to shelter our family for generations. And now, David was bringing real estate agents to assess its market value, likely contemplating selling it to developers for precisely the fate Thomas had promised to prevent. Diana, I called, my voice steadier than I expected. I need your opinion on something. She joined me, still wearing her clay-stained apron, and reviewed the correspondence I'd discovered. This changes everything, she said finally. Thomas wasn't just helping Eleanor and David financially. He was honoring a promise to the previous owners, a promise that extended to how the property would be used in the future. And I'm the keeper of that promise now, I realized aloud. Diana nodded. The question is, what do you want to do with that responsibility? I gathered the documents carefully, arranging them in chronological order. I need to speak with Richard, and then I need to make some decisions that have nothing to do with Eleanor and David's threats. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the crystalline clarity of purpose that comes from understanding one's true position. I wasn't just a mother being erased from her family's life, or a widow defending her husband's financial arrangements. I was the custodian of a legacy that extended beyond my immediate family, a responsibility I hadn't fully comprehended until now. My phone call with Richard that evening was brief but productive. I explained what Caroline had observed and what I had discovered in Thomas's correspondence. This adds another dimension to our position, he agreed. The house wasn't simply a financial vehicle, it was part of a larger ethical commitment. David and Eleanor's apparent interest in potentially selling the property constitutes a fundamental breach of the original intent. What are my options? I asked. Several, Richard replied, including rescinding the favorable purchase offer and requiring full market rate compensation if they wish to acquire the property, or maintaining ownership and establishing legally binding covenants on the property's future use before any transfer occurs. Can you draft documents outlining both approaches? I'll make a final decision when I return next week. After ending the call, I rejoined Diana on the porch, where the setting sun had painted the sky in dramatic shades of pink and gold. "You seem different," she observed. "More centered." "I am," I confirmed. "I've been so focused on what I've lost, the relationship with Eleanor, the connection to my grandchildren, that I lost sight of what I still hold, the authority to ensure Thomas's promises are kept, with or without their cooperation." Diana smiled, a flash of fierce pride in her eyes. "That's the sister I remember, the one who knows her own mind." That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months, no longer adrift in hurt and confusion, but anchored in purpose and clarity. I would return home not as a victim seeking reconciliation at any cost, but as a woman empowered by understanding the full scope of her responsibility and fully prepared to execute it with or without her family's approval. The morning of my return home dawned clear and bright, as if the weather itself approved of my newfound resolve. Diana helped load my suitcase into the car, then embraced me with uncharacteristic fierceness. "Remember who you are," she said. "Not just Eleanor's mother or Thomas's widow, but Margaret Harrison, a woman who keeps her promises and expects others to do the same." "I will," I assured her. "And thank you for everything." The drive back felt entirely different from my journey to the coast 2 weeks earlier. Where that trip had been an escape, this return was a deliberate advance. I wasn't fleeing conflict, but moving toward resolution on my own terms. I arrived home in late afternoon to find Caroline had left fresh flowers on the kitchen table alongside the mail she'd collected. Among the usual bills and advertisements was a thick envelope from Richard containing the documents I'd requested. I would review them carefully, but first, I needed to reclaim my space. I walked through each room, opening windows to release the slight mustiness that had accumulated in my absence. In the garden, I deadheaded the roses and inspected the hydrangeas, now in full, glorious bloom. This home, my home, felt different now. Not a retreat from the world, but a base from which to engage it on my terms. That evening, I called Richard to confirm our appointment for the following morning. Then I texted Eleanor directly, bypassing the attorney barrier she'd erected. "I've returned from my trip and would like to meet with you and David tomorrow at 2 p.m. at my house. This is not a legal discussion, but a family matter. Please come prepared to listen." Her response came almost immediately. "Any discussions should go through our respective attorneys." I replied simply, "This concerns information about your father's intentions that wasn't included in the legal documentation. Your choice whether to hear it directly from me or filtered through legal representatives." No response followed, but I hadn't really expected one. Eleanor had always been stubborn, a trait she'd inherited from both Thomas and me. She would come or not. Either way, I would proceed with my plan. The next morning, Richard arrived promptly at 10, carrying his briefcase and a concerned expression. "I'm not sure about this approach, Margaret," he admitted as we settled at the dining room table. Inviting them here without their attorney present could be interpreted as an attempt to circumvent proper legal process. "I'm not asking them to sign anything or make binding decisions," I clarified. "I'm simply sharing information they need to have before we proceed. Information about their father's wishes that goes beyond legal documentation." Richard nodded reluctantly. "Just be careful what you say, and don't be surprised if they record the conversation." "I'm counting on it," I replied, which earned me a raised eyebrow. We spent the next hour reviewing the documents he'd prepared, making small adjustments to ensure they reflected my exact intentions. Once satisfied, Richard gathered his papers, Colac. "Me immediately after they leave," he instructed. "And remember, no matter how emotional things become, stick to the facts. This is about Thomas's intentions and the promises he made, not about your hurt feelings or their neglect." "Understood," I agreed, walking him to the door. "This isn't about punishment, it's about responsibility." At precisely 1:58 p.m., a car pulled into my driveway. Eleanor and David emerged, both dressed in what I recognized as their professional attire. Eleanor in a tailored gray suit, David in navy blue with a tie. Armor, of a sort. Through the car's back window, I glimpsed Michael's profile, head bent over what was likely his phone. I opened the door before they could ring the bell. "Thank you for coming. Please come in." Eleanor hesitated, glancing back at the car. Michael insisted on coming. "He's waiting outside." "He's welcome inside," I offered. "We thought it best he stay out of this particular conversation." I nodded, not pressing the issue. "As you wish. Would you like tea? I've just made a pot." "This isn't a social call, Mother," Eleanor replied stiffly. "No," I agreed, leading them to the living room where I'd arranged 3 chairs around the coffee table. "But it is a family one." Once seated, I didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I discovered something during my time away that changes my understanding of your father's intentions regarding the Victorian house. Before we proceed with any legal actions, you should be aware of it." David shifted uncomfortably. "Our attorney advised us not to discuss this directly with you." "I'm not asking you to discuss or negotiate," I clarified. "I'm sharing information you don't have. After that, you're free to consult with your attorney about how to proceed." I opened Thomas's folder, removing first the collection of letters between him and the Whitfields. "Are you familiar with the previous owners of your home?" Eleanor frowned. "Vaguely. An older couple, I think. What does this have to do with anything?" "Everything." I handed her the correspondence. "Your father made specific promises to them about the future of that house, promises that directly informed how he structured the purchase and ownership." As Eleanor read, her expression shifted from skeptical to confused. David leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowing as he scanned the pages. "I don't understand," she finally said. "This was 15 years ago. How is it relevant now?" "Because the promise your father made, that the house would remain a family home, preserved rather than demolished for development, was central to why he maintained ownership through the trust. He was ensuring that promise would be kept." David's face flushed. That's not what you told the real estate agent you brought to my house while I was away?" I finished for him, watching his expression shift from anger to surprise. "Yes, I know about that visit. Just as I know you've been inquiring about development potential with Westlake Properties." Eleanor shot David a sharp look. "What is she talking about?" The momentary fracture between them confirmed my suspicion. Eleanor hadn't known about David's exploration of the property's development potential. "It was just research," David muttered. "Understanding our options." I continued calmly. "The second thing you should know is that your father established a special account, separate from his other finances, designated specifically for your eventual ownership of the house." I placed the bank statements on the table. "This fund now contains sufficient resources to facilitate the transfer of ownership, which is exactly what I believe he intended to happen around this time." Eleanor stared at the statements, visibly struggling to process this new information. "Why didn't you tell us about this before?" "Because I only discovered it recently." The account was in Thomas's name at a bank he used for business. I hadn't reviewed those records thoroughly until now. "So what are you saying?" David asked warily. "That you're willing to transfer ownership to us after all?" "I'm saying that I intend to honor Thomas's wishes, both his financial plans and his promises, to the Whitfields. He wanted you to own the home eventually, but only under conditions that would preserve its character and purpose as a family residence." I removed the final document from my folder, the one Richard had prepared based on my instructions. "This outlines a new proposal. Full transfer of ownership using the funds Thomas set aside, with a restrictive covenant preventing demolition or major structural changes without approval from the trust, which I will continue to oversee." "That's still control," David protested. "Just in a different form." "It's responsibility," I corrected. To Thomas's memory and to his promises. The financial terms are extremely favorable, far below market value. The restriction honors the commitment he made to the Whitfields. Eleanor had been silent, still studying the correspondence. Why did Dad never tell us about this promise? Because he assumed he'd be here to oversee the transition himself, I replied gently. He never anticipated leaving me to manage this, alone, or that our relationship would deteriorate to the point of legal threats. For the first time since they'd arrived, I saw a flicker of shame cross Eleanor's face. She set down the letters, her professional facade cracking slightly. "We should discuss this with our attorney," she said finally, but her voice lacked the defensive edge it had carried earlier. "Of course," I agreed. "Take these copies with you. My offer stands for 2 weeks. After that, I'll pursue other options to ensure Thomas's promises are kept." As they rose to leave, I added, "One more thing. The legal arrangement is separate from my relationship with you and my grandchildren. I've stopped expecting what I'm not freely offered. But if you ever decide family connection matters to you, my door remains open. No conditions attached to that part." They left without further discussion, taking the documents with them. Through the window. I watched as Michael looked up expectantly from the car, asking questions his parents answered with short, tense responses. I had laid my cards on the table. Not as a surrender, but as a declaration of terms based on principle rather than emotion. Whatever happened next would no longer be driven by hurt or neglect, but by a clear-eyed assessment of who was willing to honor promises made and who was not. For the first time in months, I felt neither anger nor anguish, only the quiet certainty that comes from standing firmly in one's own truth. 5 days passed without word from Eleanor or David. I didn't chase a response, choosing instead to focus on reclaiming aspects of my life that had been overshadowed by family conflict. I rejoined my book club, accepted an invitation to serve on the library's fundraising committee, and spent one afternoon helping Caroline plant a butterfly garden in her backyard. "You seem different," she observed as we pressed seedlings into freshly turned soil. "More present." "I am," I agreed. "For months, I've been reacting, to being forgotten, to legal threats, to feeling erased. Now I'm choosing how to live, regardless of their decisions." On the 6th day, an unexpected text arrived from Michael. "Grandma, can I talk to you? Just me. It's important." I hesitated only briefly before responding. "Of course. When would you like to come over?" "Now?" came the immediate reply. "I'm at soccer practice nearby. Could walk over after." An hour later, my doorbell rang. Michael stood on the porch, tall and gangly in his practice uniform, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. His expression was a mixture of defiance and uncertainty that reminded me so much of Eleanor at his age that my heart contracted. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "Are you hungry? I just made banana bread." He nodded, following me to the kitchen with the awkward gait of a boy not yet comfortable with his rapidly changing body. As I sliced the bread and poured milk, Michael fidgeted with his phone case, snapping it on and off nervously. "Mom and Dad don't know I'm here," he finally blurted. "They've been arguing ever since your meeting. Dad wants to sell the house and move somewhere bigger, but Mom keeps talking about promises and family legacy." I set a plate in front of him, careful to keep my expression neutral. "That sounds difficult to be around." "It sucks," he agreed, taking a bite of banana bread. After chewing thoughtfully, he added, "This is good, like the ones you used to bring us." The recipe hasn't changed. He met my eyes directly for perhaps the first time since he'd arrived. "Why did you stop coming over? Was it because of my birthday party? When Dad said you couldn't come because we didn't have enough room?" The question caught me off guard. "Your birthday party? Last year, my 13th. Dad told me you couldn't come because we were only having a small celebration at the laser tag place. But then I saw the photos. There were like 20 people there." A piece of the puzzle I hadn't even known was missing clicked into place. I'd never received an invitation to Michael's birthday. When I'd called Eleanor to ask about it afterward, she'd been vague. Just a small thing with his school friends. She'd said, "Michael, I was never invited to your birthday. I would have been there if I had been." His face flushed with anger. "I knew it. I told Mom I wanted you there. She said she'd call you." I reached across the table and gently touched his hand. Sometimes adults make mistakes, especially when relationships get complicated. "It's stupid," he declared with the absolute certainty of a 14-year-old. "You're my grandmother. You're supposed to be at my birthday." "I'd like to be," I said simply. "This year and all the years to come." Michael nodded, then reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a slightly crumpled envelope. "Here, I made this for your birthday. Mom said she'd mail it, but I found it in her desk drawer yesterday." The card inside was handmade, with a carefully drawn picture of what appeared to be Michael and me sitting on a bench, fishing poles in hand. Inside, in his messy, adolescent handwriting, "Happy birthday, Grandma. Remember when you took me fishing and I fell in the lake? That was awesome. Love, Michael." The memory of a 7-year-old Michael tumbling off the dock at Thomas's favorite fishing spot, more delighted than frightened by his unexpected swim, brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I said, voice slightly unsteady. "This means a great deal to me." "I want to come over more," he declared. "I'm old enough to decide that for myself." In that moment, looking at his determined young face, I saw the first fragile bridge being rebuilt across the chasm that had formed in our family, not through legal documents or property arrangements, but through the simple, honest connection of shared memories and genuine care. "My door is always open to you," I promised. Always. Michael's visit proved to be the first crack in the wall that had formed between Eleanor and me. 3 days later, I received a formal letter from their attorney acknowledging receipt of my proposal and requesting a meeting between all parties. The tone was markedly different from earlier communications, less confrontational, more exploratory. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at Richard's office, neutral territory for this tentative step toward resolution. I arrived early, taking a moment in the car to center myself before entering. This wasn't about winning or losing, I reminded myself. It was about finding a path forward that honored Thomas's intentions while acknowledging current realities. Inside the conference room, Eleanor and David sat on one side of the polished table, their attorney between them. I took my place beside Richard, noting Eleanor's tense posture and David's carefully neutral expression. What followed was 2 hours of detailed discussion about the house, the special fund Thomas had established, and the restrictive covenant I'd proposed. Their attorney raised objections, Richard countered. Terms were adjusted, and gradually a framework emerged that all parties could accept. Throughout the negotiation, I maintained a calm, matter-of-fact demeanor, focusing on practical matters rather than emotional grievances. When David attempted to characterize the restrictive covenant as excessive control, I simply redirected the conversation to Thomas's documented promises to the Whitfields. "This isn't about control," I explained. "It's about honoring a commitment that predates your occupancy of the house." Thomas gave his word that the property would remain a single-family residence, preserved in its historical character. I'm simply ensuring that promise continues to be kept. By the meeting's end, we had reached a preliminary agreement. Ownership would transfer to Eleanor and David using the funds Thomas had set aside, with a modified covenant that preserved the essential character of the house while allowing for reasonable modernization and improvements. The financial terms were favorable, as Thomas had intended, but not the complete gift they might have originally expected. As the attorneys finalized details, an awkward silence fell between Eleanor, David, and me. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "Michael told us he visited you." "Yes," I acknowledged. "He brought me a birthday card." A flush crept up her neck. I should have mailed it. There's no excuse. No, I agreed quietly. There isn't. David cleared his throat. We've been discussing things, as a family, about reconnecting. The words seemed difficult for him. Michael has been quite insistent. Amelia, too, Eleanor added. She was upset when we stopped the visits for her school project. I allowed myself a small smile. They're good children. You've raised them well in many ways. We thought maybe Sunday dinner? Eleanor suggested tentatively. Just family. No discussions about the house or legal matters. I considered the invitation carefully. Part of me wanted to accept immediately, to grasp this olive branch with both hands. But the wiser part, the part that had emerged during my time with Diana, recognized the need for clear boundaries. I'd like that, I said finally. With one condition, that we begin with honesty. No pretending the past few months didn't happen. No glossing over difficult truths. We start fresh, but we acknowledge how we got here. Eleanor and David exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. That's fair, Eleanor conceded. Though it won't be easy. Few worthwhile. Things are, I replied. As we prepared to leave, Richard pulled me aside. Are you sure about this? The legal agreement protects your financial interests, but emotional reconciliation is much more complicated. I'm not expecting perfection, I assured him. Just a beginning, with boundaries intact. That Sunday, I arrived at the Victorian house, carrying a bouquet of hydrangeas from my garden and a freshly baked apple pie, Thomas's favorite. The atmosphere was tentative, conversation sometimes stilted, but beneath the awkwardness ran a current of genuine effort. After dinner, as David and the children cleared the table, Eleanor followed me onto the front porch. We stood side by side. Looking out at the garden Thomas and I had helped them plant 15 years earlier. I didn't understand what Dad was trying to do with this house arrangement, she admitted quietly. Not until I read those letters. He was protecting everyone, I said. The Whitfields, you and David, the house itself. That was his way. And you? She asked. What are you protecting now? I turned to face her directly. Myself. My dignity. The relationship I want with my grandchildren, and yes, Thomas's promises too. She nodded slowly. I think I'm finally beginning to understand that. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't even full reconciliation. But as the evening ended with tentative plans for another dinner the following month, I recognized it for what it was, a mindful reconstruction, building something new and potentially stronger on the foundation of difficult truths finally acknowledged. As I drove home in the gathering twilight, I felt Thomas's presence beside me, approving. Not of victory or vindication, but of boundaries lovingly maintained and promises honorably kept. 6 months passed, each day a small step in the rebuilding of fractured relationships. The formal transfer of the Victorian house had been completed. The legal documents signed and filed without further conflict. The restrictive covenant remained, a silent guardian of Thomas's promises to the Whitfields, but it had faded into the background of our family dynamics, rarely mentioned now that its purpose was understood. Our monthly Sunday dinners had become a fixture once more, though different from before. Where past gatherings had often felt like obligations performed out of habit, these new connections carried the intentionality that comes from nearly losing something valuable. We were careful with each other now, more attentive to undercurrents and unspoken needs. On a crisp autumn afternoon, I sat in my garden reviewing student essays from the creative writing class I'd begun teaching at the community center. The temperature had dropped, but sunshine bathed the yard in golden light, and I'd wrapped myself in one of Thomas's old cardigans, a comfort I still allowed myself on days when memories felt particularly close. The sound of a car door closing drew my attention. Eleanor walked up the garden path, carrying a large cardboard box. She'd taken to dropping by occasionally between our scheduled dinners, Brief visits that felt like bridge-building exercises, each one slightly less awkward than the last. I found these in the attic, she explained, setting the box on the patio table. I thought you might want them. Inside were photo albums and memorabilia from my teaching years, award ceremonies, class photos, graduation cards from former students. I'd stored them at Eleanor's house years ago when Thomas and I were decluttering, never expecting they'd become artifacts of a life Eleanor would need to rediscover. Thank you, I said, lifting out a particularly treasured album. I've been thinking about these recently, especially since starting the writing class. Eleanor sat beside me, tentatively at first, then with more confidence as I began turning pages. I don't think I ever really understood your teaching career, she admitted. How important it was to you. It was my other family, I explained. Just as Thomas had his architectural projects, I had my students. We both needed purpose beyond our family life. She traced a finger over a class photo from 1987, lingering on my younger face, standing proudly among rows of teenagers. I think I was jealous sometimes, she confessed, the words emerging as if she'd only just recognized this truth herself. Of how much they admired you. The admission hung between us, a previously unacknowledged piece of our complicated puzzle. I never knew that. I didn't either, not consciously. She continued exploring the albums, pausing occasionally to ask questions about particular students or events. Then she pulled out a folder I hadn't noticed, marked Property Documents, Thomas. This was mixed in with the school materials, she explained, opening it to reveal more correspondence between Thomas and the Whitfields. There's something here. I think you should see. The letter she handed me was dated shortly after we'd purchased the Victorian, written by Mrs. Whitfield to Thomas. It described how they had chosen our offer over the developer's higher bid, specifically because Thomas had shared our family story, including details about Eleanor expecting her first child and our hopes for multi-generational family connections, centered around the house. We are entrusting you with not just a house but a vessel for family memories, I read aloud from the letter. Knowing that your grandchildren will someday run through the same halls where our grandchildren once played brings us immeasurable peace. Eleanor's eyes glistened. Dad never showed me this. He wouldn't have, I said gently. He didn't want you to feel burdened by expectation. But that's exactly what the house was. A burden of expectation. Her voice carried no bitterness now, only dawning comprehension, not just financially, but emotionally, a trust we didn't even know we were carrying. For Thomas, it wasn't a burden, but a gift, creating continuity across generations. I carefully returned the letter to its folder. He believed in the power of place, of roots. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, then said, When you revealed you owned our house, I was angry because it felt like control. I didn't understand it was actually connection he was trying to preserve. Not just Thomas, I corrected softly. Me too. The autumn light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the garden. Eleanor gathered her purse, preparing to leave. Michael's birthday is next month, she said, almost casually. He wants a family celebration here, in your garden. Would that be all right? The request, so simple yet so significant, brought a warmth that had nothing to do with Thomas's old cardigan. I would like that very much. As Eleanor's car pulled away, I returned to my garden chair, surrounded by rediscovered memories and newly revealed truths. The ownership of houses, I reflected, was ultimately less important than the stewardship of relationships. Both required maintenance, boundaries, and occasionally difficult renovations. Thomas had understood this all along. In his methodical, forward-thinking way, he had tried to create structures that would protect what mattered most, even after he was gone. What he couldn't have designed was the journey we would need to take to understand the true value of what he'd built. I smiled, touching the worn sleeve of his cardigan, feeling closer to him than I had in years. "You were right," I whispered to the evening air. "Just not in the way you expected." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.